Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I've always found solace in Algonquin Provincial Park, particularly during the harsh isolation of winter months. The massive wilderness stretches endlessly across Ontario's untamed landscape, a frozen sanctuary where civilization feels like a distant memory. Most sensible people avoid the backcountry trails when December settles in with its bone-deep cold and abbreviated daylight. The snow transforms familiar paths into treacherous obstacles, temperatures plummet to dangerous levels, and darkness swallows the forest by late afternoon. But these very conditions draw me deeper into the wild. My name doesn't matter for this story, but my profession does. I work remotely as a software consultant, which grants me the precious freedom to disappear into nature whenever the walls of my small apartment begin closing in. Living alone has its advantages. No one questions my sudden departures or worries when I vanish for days at a time. My only constant companion is Rex, my 4-year-old German Shepherd. He's exceptionally well-trained, alert without being aggressive, calm under pressure yet fiercely protective when necessary. His presence transforms solitary hikes from potentially dangerous adventures into manageable expeditions. This particular nightmare unfolded approximately 5 years ago, during what I'd expected to be a routine winter excursion. The weather forecast promised clear skies and stable temperatures, ideal conditions for a challenging day hike. I'd planned a 12-mile loop through some of the park's more remote sections, areas where even summer crowds rarely venture. The isolation appealed to me. No chattering tourists, no screaming children, just pristine wilderness and the therapeutic rhythm of boots against snow-packed earth. Rex and I departed my apartment before dawn, driving north through empty highways as the sun crept slowly above the horizon. The 3-hour journey passed peacefully, my mind clearing with each mile that separated me from the city's suffocating embrace. Classical music filled the car's interior while Rex dozed contentedly in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting his head to watch the changing landscape through frost-covered windows. We reached the Brent Road trailhead just after 1 p.m., later than I'd originally planned due to unexpected traffic delays. The parking area sat completely deserted, exactly as I'd hoped. Snow had accumulated heavily overnight, blanketing everything in pristine white that sparkled brilliantly under the afternoon sun. The temperature gauge in my car read -15 Celsius. Cold enough to be dangerous but not life-threatening with proper preparation. I gathered my equipment methodically: insulated water bottles, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, headlamp, extra batteries, thermal layers, and enough food for an unexpected overnight stay. Rex watched patiently as I double-checked each item, his intelligent brown eyes tracking my movements with quiet understanding. He knew these preparations meant adventure ahead. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through dense stands of snow-laden pine and birch trees. Our boots crunched rhythmically against the packed snow as we established a comfortable pace. Rex trotted confidently ahead, nose working constantly, reading the forest's invisible messages with the expertise of a wilderness veteran. The air tasted sharp and clean, each breath burning slightly in my lungs before warming my core. For the first hour, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The trail markers appeared at regular intervals, confirming our progress through increasingly remote terrain. We crossed several frozen streams, their surfaces covered by thick ice that groaned ominously under our weight but held firm. The forest felt alive around us, not threatening, just vibrantly present. Squirrel tracks crisscrossed our path, and occasional bird calls echoed from the canopy above. The landscape gradually opened into broader clearings, separated by dense woodland sections. Each vista revealed new perspectives of the park's magnificent scope, rolling hills disappearing into misty distance, frozen wetlands gleaming like mirrors, and rock formations jutting dramatically from snow-covered slopes. This was why I endured the risks and discomfort of winter hiking, moments of transcendent beauty impossible to experience any other way. Rex seemed to share my appreciation, tail wagging as he investigated particularly interesting scent trails or paused to gaze across scenic overlooks. His behavior remained relaxed and playful, showing no signs of the alertness that typically preceded wildlife encounters. Bears were hibernating. Wolves rarely ventured this close to human-trafficked areas, and other predators posed minimal winter threats. We were alone in paradise. By 3 p.m., we'd covered roughly 6 miles through varied terrain without incident. My confidence grew with each successful mile marker. The weather held steady, clear, and cold, but not dangerously so. My gear performed flawlessly, keeping me warm and dry despite the challenging conditions. Rex showed no signs of fatigue, his thick coat providing natural insulation against the elements. Everything suggested we'd complete our planned route without complications. I began allowing myself to relax fully, soaking in the profound silence that only deep wilderness provides. No traffic noise, no industrial hum, no human voices, just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant crack of settling ice. This peace was what I craved during stressful work periods, the antidote to modern life's relentless pressure and artificial urgency. 2 hours into our journey, we reached a spectacular clearing overlooking a small frozen lake surrounded by steep hills. The view demanded a rest stop, so I shared water with Rex while admiring the scenery spread before us. The lake's surface gleamed like polished steel, perfectly flat and unmarked by any disturbance. Hills rose sharply on all sides, their snow-covered slopes creating natural amphitheater walls that amplified even the smallest sounds. I tossed Rex a stick retrieved from beneath the snow, watching him bound enthusiastically across the clearing in pursuit. His joyful energy was infectious, temporarily banishing any concerns about our schedule or the approaching darkness. For several minutes, we played together in the open space, both grateful for the opportunity to stretch and move freely after navigating narrow forest paths. When I finally checked my watch, genuine alarm struck me like a physical blow. The display read 4:20 p.m., much later than I'd realized. Winter's abbreviated daylight was vanishing rapidly, and we still faced approximately 45 minutes of hiking before reaching the parking lot. I cursed my negligence silently, angry at myself for losing track of time so carelessly. GPS confirmation of our position only worsened my growing anxiety. Rex sensed my sudden tension immediately, abandoning his stick to return to my side with concerned attentiveness. His ears perked forward, scanning our surroundings for whatever had triggered my distress. I forced myself to remain calm, not wanting to communicate panic to my companion unnecessarily. We simply needed to maintain a steady pace and focus on navigation, nothing more complicated than that. As we prepared to leave the clearing, something caught my peripheral vision near the trail's edge. Embedded clearly in fresh snow was a single boot print, significantly larger and deeper than any I'd made during our ascent. The impression was sharp and recent, definitely created within the past few hours. My stomach tightened uncomfortably as I knelt to examine it more closely. The print was massive, easily size 13 or 14, with a distinctive tread pattern I didn't recognize. Deep heel impressions suggested considerable weight, probably a large man carrying substantial gear. But scanning the surrounding area revealed nothing else. No additional footprints leading toward or away from this solitary mark. No disturbed snow indicating movement in any direction. Rex sniffed curiously at the impression but showed no particular interest or concern. His relaxed demeanor suggested whatever had created the print posed no immediate threat. Still, uneasiness crept steadily through my chest. How does a single footprint appear in isolation? People don't hop on one foot through wilderness areas, especially not in challenging winter conditions. Despite my mounting concerns, we pressed forward along the trail as daylight continued its relentless retreat. The forest around us grew increasingly dense, towering pines blocking what remained of the afternoon sun and casting long shadows across our path. Temperature dropped noticeably as we lost direct sunlight, and I pulled my jacket tighter against the deepening cold. Rex maintained his position slightly ahead, but I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. His ears remained constantly alert, swiveling towards sounds I couldn't detect. His pace became more measured, less playful than earlier in the day. When he paused to investigate scents, his body language suggested heightened awareness rather than casual curiosity. Something in the environment was setting him on edge. The trail began winding through a particularly thick section of forest where snow-heavy branches formed natural tunnels overhead. Visibility dropped dramatically in the perpetual twilight, forcing me to rely heavily on my GPS device and carefully placed trail markers. Each turn revealed only more identical-looking forest, creating a disorienting sense of traveling in circles despite our steady progress. 10 minutes after leaving the clearing, we encountered another anomaly. Pressed clearly into the snow beside a large pine tree was a second boot print, identical in size and tread pattern to the first. Again, it appeared completely isolated, with no corresponding tracks leading to or from its location. The impossibility of the situation sent cold tendrils of fear crawling up my spine. I forced myself to consider rational explanations. Perhaps another hiker had passed through earlier, and wind or fresh snowfall had obscured their other tracks. Maybe they'd stepped off the trail briefly before returning to the path. But examining the surrounding area revealed no evidence supporting these theories. The snow remained undisturbed except for that single, ominous impression. Rex whined softly, pressing closer against my legs. His warm presence provided some comfort, but I could feel tension radiating from his muscular frame. Dogs possess senses far superior to humans. If he detected something threatening, I needed to trust his instincts completely. We were no longer alone in these woods, and whoever shared our space wasn't making their presence known through normal means. The realization that someone might be tracking us, deliberately staying hidden while monitoring our movements, sent waves of nausea through my stomach. We were miles from help, surrounded by endless wilderness where anything could happen without witnesses or consequences. I quickened our pace significantly, no longer caring about enjoying the scenery or maintaining casual hiking rhythms. Another 10 minutes of rapid hiking brought us to the edge of a large, snow-covered meadow. The open space stretched roughly 200 yards across, surrounded by walls of dark forest on all sides. Normally, such clearings provided welcome relief from claustrophobic forest sections, but now the exposure felt dangerous and vulnerable. Crossing open ground would make us visible from any direction. The sky had darkened to deep gray blue, and the first stars were becoming faintly visible overhead. My watch confirmed my worst fears. 4:45 p.m. with full darkness approaching rapidly. We needed to cover significant distance quickly if we hoped to reach the parking lot before total nightfall. The alternative, navigating unfamiliar trails in complete darkness, was far too dangerous to consider seriously. Halfway across the meadow, pure terror struck me with overwhelming force. Every muscle in my body contracted simultaneously, and my heart began racing with such intensity I feared it might burst. Rex froze instantly beside me, hackles rising along his neck as a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. His reaction confirmed what my subconscious had already detected. We were being watched. Slowly, fighting every instinct screaming at me to run immediately, I turned to scan the forest behind us. At the meadow's far edge, where we'd emerged from the tree line, stood a motionless human figure. Even at considerable distance, its presence radiated menace and wrongness. The shape was tall and broad, darker than the shadows surrounding it, perfectly still in a way that suggested infinite patience and control. No details were visible across the intervening space. No facial features, clothing, or equipment could be distinguished. Just a silent silhouette that somehow conveyed predatory intent through posture alone. The figure hadn't been there when we'd entered the clearing moments earlier. It had appeared soundlessly, positioned deliberately to block our retreat route. My mind raced through increasingly desperate explanations. Maybe another hiker had coincidentally arrived at the same location. Perhaps they were simply resting after their own challenging day on the trails. But deep in my gut, primal instincts rejected these comfortable rationalizations. This wasn't coincidence or innocent encounter. This was deliberate stalking behavior. Rex's growl intensified, and he positioned himself protectively between me and the distant figure. His training as a guard dog was asserting itself, recognizing a genuine threat that required immediate response. I trusted his judgment completely. He'd never reacted this way to normal hikers or wildlife encounters. The figure remained absolutely motionless, waiting, watching. The sense of being studied like prey by an intelligent predator overwhelmed me completely. Whatever this person wanted, it wasn't friendly conversation or trail directions. Terror finally overcame paralysis, flooding my system with adrenaline that made everything crystal clear. I spun away from the watching figure and bolted across the remaining meadow distance, Rex immediately matching my frantic pace. Snow exploded around our feet as we crashed through the deeper drifts, heading desperately toward the forest on the opposite side. Behind us, I heard nothing, no pursuing footsteps, no shouted commands, no breaking branches. The silence was somehow more terrifying than obvious chase sounds would have been. A predator confident in its abilities doesn't need to rush. It simply follows steadily, wearing down its prey through sustained pressure and inevitable exhaustion. We plunged into the forest at full speed, careening down the narrow trail with reckless abandon. Branches whipped against my face and caught at my jacket, but I didn't slow down. Rex ran beside me, leash stretched taut, his powerful stride keeping perfect pace with my desperate sprint. Low-hanging obstacles that would normally require careful navigation were ignored completely, as survival instincts overrode all other considerations. My breathing became labored quickly in the thin, cold air. Each inhalation burned my lungs, and my exhaled breath formed thick clouds that partially obscured my vision. Sweat began freezing against my skin, despite the frantic exertion warming my core. The backpack bounced heavily against my spine, its weight becoming increasingly burdensome as fatigue accumulated. The trail wound through increasingly challenging terrain, steep descents that threatened to send me tumbling out of control, narrow passages between closely spaced trees, and icy sections where maintaining footing required constant vigilance. Under normal circumstances, I would have proceeded cautiously through such obstacles. Now driven by primal fear, I attacked each challenge with desperate determination. Rex began showing signs of strain as well, his normally effortless gait becoming more labored. His tongue lolled from his mouth, and his breathing grew visibly heavier. But he never slowed or hesitated, matching my intensity with loyal dedication. Together, we formed a team united by shared desperation and mutual dependence. Despite our frantic pace, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that we were being followed. No sounds of pursuit reached my ears, but the feeling of hostile observation pressed against my back like a physical weight. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide watching eyes. Every noise, wind through branches, settling snow, distant animal calls, might mask approaching footsteps. The forest felt different now, transformed from peaceful sanctuary into hostile environment. Trees that had seemed welcoming earlier now loomed threateningly overhead. The deepening darkness contained infinite hiding places for patient predators. Even familiar trail markers appeared sinister and wrong, as though the entire landscape had shifted into something malevolent. 20 minutes of sustained sprinting brought us to the final major obstacle before the parking area, a steep switchbacked climb up a wooded hillside. The ascent would normally require careful pacing and frequent rest stops, but time was running out rapidly. Full darkness was perhaps 15 minutes away, and being caught on this exposed slope after nightfall would be catastrophic. I attacked the bottom of the switchback with grim determination, immediately feeling the brutal incline bite into my already exhausted leg muscles. The trail zigzagged back and forth up the steep face, each turn providing momentary relief before revealing another punishing climb ahead. Rex struggled beside me, his claws scratching for purchase on increasingly icy surfaces. Halfway up the slope, curiosity finally overcame my fear. I had to know if we were truly being pursued, or if paranoid imagination was driving our desperate flight. Pausing briefly at a switchback turn, I forced myself to look back down the hill toward the forest below. What I saw destroyed any remaining hope for innocent explanations. The figure stood at the bottom of the climb, no longer maintaining distance or attempting concealment. Even in the dim light, I could see he was massive, well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful build that suggested both strength and endurance. He wore dark clothing that made him blend almost seamlessly with the shadows, and he carried what appeared to be a large backpack. Most terrifying was his complete stillness. He wasn't breathing heavily from exertion or scanning the area uncertainly like a lost hiker would. Instead, He stared directly up at me with the focused intensity of an experienced hunter who had successfully cornered his quarry. The distance between us meant I couldn't distinguish facial features, but his posture radiated confidence and patience. Then he began moving, not with the stumbling urgency of someone struggling through difficult terrain, but with fluid, powerful strides that ignored the steep grade entirely. He abandoned the switchback trail completely, cutting directly up the hillside at angles that should have been impossible to maintain on the icy slope. His pace was inhuman, steady, relentless, gaining ground with every step despite the punishing terrain. Panic exploded through my chest like liquid fire. This wasn't a confused fellow hiker or opportunistic criminal. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, someone who had planned this encounter carefully and possessed the skills to execute it flawlessly. I was being hunted by an expert. Rex barked once, sharply, his warning cutting through the evening air like a gunshot. The sound galvanized me back into motion, and we resumed our desperate climb with renewed intensity. But the figure below continued his relentless ascent, and the gap between us shrank steadily despite our best efforts. My legs burned with exhaustion as we finally crested the hill's summit, emerging into the parking area with gasping relief. But joy turned instantly to horror as I processed what lay before us. Parked directly beside my Subaru was a black pickup truck with oversized tires and tinted windows. The vehicle hadn't been there when we'd arrived hours earlier. I was absolutely certain of that. The implications crashed over me like an avalanche. Whoever had been stalking us through the forest had somehow anticipated our return route. They'd positioned their vehicle strategically, creating a trap that left me with nowhere to run. The nearest civilization was miles away down a single-access road, and my pursuer controlled that escape route completely. My hands shook violently as I fumbled for car keys buried deep in my jacket pocket. The simple metal objects felt foreign and unwieldy, slipping through my numb fingers as panic overwhelmed fine motor control. Rex pressed against my legs, whining anxiously as he sensed my terror reaching breaking point. Behind us, footsteps pounded steadily up the final section of trail. Our pursuer was perhaps 30 seconds away from reaching the parking area, and I still hadn't managed to unlock my car. The keys slipped again, falling onto the snow-covered pavement with a muffled jingle that sounded deafeningly loud in the evening stillness. "God help me," I whispered, dropping to my knees to search frantically through the snow. Rex began barking continuously now, his warning cries echoing off the surrounding hills. My fingers, clumsy with cold and fear, finally closed around the keys just as heavy footsteps reached the parking area behind me. I lurched upward, jabbing the key toward the door lock with desperate precision. The mechanism clicked open, and I yanked the door wide, practically throwing Rex into the passenger seat before diving behind the steering wheel. My hands trembled so violently I could barely insert the ignition key. The engine turned over immediately, its familiar rumble providing the first sense of safety I'd felt in hours. But as I threw the car into reverse, movement in my peripheral vision made me glance toward the black truck. The figure was climbing calmly into the driver's seat, showing no urgency or concern about my imminent escape. His relaxed demeanor was somehow more terrifying than aggressive pursuit would have been. He wasn't worried about me getting away because he knew something I didn't. Perhaps he'd tampered with my vehicle, or maybe he understood the local roads well enough to intercept me regardless of my head start. The confidence in his movements suggested someone who had executed similar hunts before. I gunned the accelerator, tires spinning briefly on the icy pavement before finding traction. Gravel and snow sprayed behind me as I reversed rapidly, then shifted into drive and floored the gas pedal. My car shot forward down the access road, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. In my rearview mirror, I watched the black truck's headlights flare to life. The vehicle pulled out of the parking space with deliberate precision, following me down the mountain road at a distance that maintained visual contact without appearing obviously threatening. The driver was playing a psychological game, allowing me to think I might escape while demonstrating his continued control over the situation. The winding access road descended through miles of empty forest, with no side roads or buildings offering potential refuge. If he wanted to force me off the road or block my path, countless locations would provide perfect opportunities. Every curve might hide an ambush. Every straight section might reveal his truck gaining ground rapidly. Rex remained pressed against my side, his warm presence providing minimal comfort against the overwhelming terror consuming my thoughts. I drove faster than was safe on the treacherous road, taking curves at speeds that sent my car sliding toward guardrails and drop-offs. But slowing down felt even more dangerous than crashing. The truck's headlights never disappeared from my mirror, maintaining their steady pursuit like the eyes of some mechanical predator. Whatever this person wanted, they were willing to follow me indefinitely until they found the right opportunity to act. The realization that I might not survive this night settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Miles passed in terrified silence, broken only by Rex's occasional whimpers and the engine's strained whining as I pushed it beyond safe limits. The truck never gained ground, but it never fell behind either. My pursuer was content to wait, knowing that eventually I'd have to stop for gas, or fatigue would force a mistake, or simple statistical probability would create the opening he needed. 20 miles from the park, approaching the first small town with its promise of witnesses and help, the truck's headlights suddenly vanished from my mirror. I checked constantly for several more miles, but the road behind remained empty and dark. My stalker had disappeared as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving me with questions that would haunt me for years afterward. I drove straight to the local police station, bursting through their doors with Rex at my side, and a story that sounded increasingly unbelievable as I recounted each detail. The duty officer listened patiently, took detailed notes, and promised to investigate thoroughly. But I could see skepticism in his eyes. My tale of isolated footprints and patient stalkers seemed more like paranoid delusion than criminal activity. 3 days later, they called to report their findings. No other vehicles had been registered at the Brent Road trailhead that day. No suspicious activity had been reported anywhere in the park. Security cameras along the access road showed only my Subaru entering and leaving the area. According to official records, I'd been completely alone throughout my entire visit. But I knew better. Somewhere in Algonquin's vast wilderness, a patient hunter was still waiting. And the next time someone ventures alone into those frozen woods during winter's darkest hours, they might not be fortunate enough to escape as I did. The forest remembers everything, and some memories are too terrifying to forget. Three summers back, our family tradition led us once again to the remote lake house at Pine Ridge. My grandparents had been renting the same weathered cabin for decades, drawn by the isolation and the pristine waters that stretched endlessly toward the tree line. The drive took us deep into rural territory, where cell towers became scarce, and the nearest town was 40 minutes of winding roads away. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, dust clouds swirling behind our packed SUV, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. The cabin always looked different than I remembered. Smaller, more decrepit, like it was slowly surrendering to the wilderness around it. The wood siding had darkened over the years, stained by countless storms and seasons. Several shutters hung at odd angles, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. What struck me most unsettling that particular year was the neighboring property. As we unloaded our bags, I noticed a family by their pool area suddenly gathering their belongings. They moved with unusual haste, constantly glancing in our direction with expressions I couldn't quite read. The adults whispered urgently to their children, who kept looking back at us over their shoulders as they were ushered inside. Within 10 minutes of our arrival, their entire outdoor area was abandoned, and I could see them watching us through their windows, curtains pulled just slightly aside. My grandfather dismissed my concerns with a wave of his weathered hand. "Some folks just prefer their privacy," he said, but even he seemed to notice the unusual behavior. The lake stretched out before us, its surface mirror smooth and reflecting the darkening sky. Something about the water seemed different too, more opaque, almost black despite the late afternoon sun. The usual sounds of summer evening were notably absent. No loons calling across the water, no fish jumping, no insects buzzing around the shoreline. That first night brought an uncomfortable awareness that we weren't alone in these remote woods. After dinner, as we sat around the fire pit roasting marshmallows, strange sounds carried across the water, not the typical night sounds you'd expect. These were deliberate, purposeful noises, occasional splashing from the far shore, too rhythmic to be wildlife, too measured to be natural. My younger brother, Tyler, was the first to comment on it. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, pointing toward the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. We all strained to listen, and sure enough, there it was, a steady, repetitive sound like someone methodically moving through shallow water. The sound would continue for several minutes, then stop abruptly, only to resume from a different location along the distant shoreline. Grandmother tried to lighten the mood by suggesting it was probably just beavers building a dam, but her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her own unease. Grandfather remained silent, staring intently across the black water. I noticed his jaw was clenched, and his hands gripped his coffee mug with white knuckles. When we finally retreated inside for the night, I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on all the doors and windows. The cabin's isolation, which had always felt like a peaceful escape from urban life, now felt more like a trap. We were miles from any help, surrounded by dense forest and connected to civilization by a single winding road. The nearest neighbor, the family who had fled their pool area upon our arrival, was at least a quarter-mile away through thick woods. As I lay in my narrow bunk bed, listening to the old cabin settle and creak around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The familiar comfort of our summer retreat had been replaced by an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. The second night brought restlessness that seemed to infect both Tyler and me. We tossed and turned in our respective bunks, the uncomfortable mattresses and stuffy cabin air making genuine rest impossible. Around midnight, Tyler suggested we sneak outside for some fresh air and perhaps indulge in the small stash of marijuana we had carefully hidden from our family. The idea appealed to me more than it should have. Despite the previous night's strange sounds and general atmosphere of unease, the teenage urge for rebellion and altered consciousness proved stronger than caution. We waited until the deep, rhythmic breathing from our grandparents' room indicated they were sound asleep, then carefully made our way to the back door. The night air hit us with surprising intensity, thick, humid, and carrying strange scents that I couldn't identify. Not the usual pine and lake water smells, but something earthier, more organic, something that reminded me of turned soil and decay. Tyler produced the small bag and rolling papers from his jacket pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared our contraband. We decided to walk down to the small inlet about 100 yards from the cabin, where a fallen log created a natural bench overlooking the water. The moonlight was unusually bright that night, casting everything in stark silver and deep black shadows. As we walked, our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the pine needle carpet, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain we were being observed. The log sat at the edge of a small clearing that offered an unobstructed view across the lake. In daylight, this was one of my favorite spots, peaceful, secluded, with excellent fishing just offshore. But in the darkness, it felt exposed and vulnerable. The trees behind us formed an impenetrable wall of shadows, while the water stretched out before us like a black void. Tyler lit up and took several deep drags before passing it to me. Within minutes, his movements became sluggish and his eyelids grew heavy. He mumbled something about feeling really good and then slumped against the log, his phone slipping from his fingers as consciousness faded away. With Tyler unconscious beside me, I found myself truly alone for the first time since we'd arrived. The marijuana heightened my senses while simultaneously clouding my judgment, creating a surreal state where every shadow seemed to move and every sound carried ominous meaning. I took Tyler's portion of our stash, reasoning that it would be wasted if left unused, and settled in for what I assumed would be a peaceful, albeit altered communion with nature. The water before me was absolutely still, like black glass reflecting the moon and stars. No ripples, no movement of any kind. Even the gentle lapping sounds that typically accompanied lakeshores were absent. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat and the rushing of blood through my veins. That's when I first noticed the disturbance across the water. It started as just a subtle wrongness in the perfect reflection of the moon on the lake's surface. A slight wavering, as if something large was moving beneath the water. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the disturbance continued to grow. The sounds began shortly after, a rhythmic splashing that seemed to come from the far shore, perhaps half a mile away. But in the perfect stillness of the night, the sound carried with crystal clarity. It wasn't random or natural. Someone or something was deliberately moving through the shallow water along the distant shoreline, and they were moving with purpose. I strained my eyes, trying to penetrate the darkness across the lake. The tree line on the far shore was a solid wall of black, but gradually I began to make out subtle variations in the darkness. A shadow that seemed darker than the others, a shape that moved independently of the swaying branches. My altered state made it difficult to trust what I was seeing, but as minutes passed, the evidence became undeniable. Someone was over there, moving systematically along the shoreline, and whatever they were doing required them to spend considerable time in the water. The splashing would continue for several minutes, then stop completely, then resume from a location further down the shore. What happened next will remain burned into my memory until the day I die. After nearly 20 minutes of intermittent sounds and movement in the distance, a figure began to emerge from the tree line on the far shore. At first it was just a darker shape against the already black background, but as it moved into the moonlight, details became horrifyingly clear. The man, for it was definitely a man, was impossibly tall, easily 6.5 feet, with a lean, angular build that looked almost skeletal in the stark moonlight. He wore dark clothing from head to toe, including a hood that obscured his face completely. But most terrifying was what he carried in his right hand, a long-handled shovel that gleamed dully in the silver light. He moved with deliberate, measured steps along the shoreline, stopping every few yards to examine something at his feet. At one point, he knelt down and appeared to be arranging or repositioning something on the ground. The shovel never left his grip, and the way he held it suggested he was completely comfortable with its weight and balance. My heart began to pound with such force. I was certain the sound would carry across the water and betray my presence. Every instinct screamed at me to wake Tyler and retreat to the safety of the cabin, but I found myself frozen, unable to look away from this nightmarish scene unfolding before me. The figure continued his methodical progress along the shoreline, and with growing horror, I realized he was working his way around the lake toward my side. At his current pace, he would reach my general area within an hour. The thought of being anywhere in this man's vicinity filled me with a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. Then, as if sensing my observation, the figure stopped moving entirely. He stood perfectly still for several long moments, and then, God help me, he turned and looked directly across the water toward my location. Even at that distance, even with his face hidden in shadow, I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing pressing against me. We remained locked in this terrifying stalemate for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Neither of us moved. Neither of us made a sound. The only proof I had that this wasn't some drug-induced hallucination was the way my heart hammered against my ribs and the cold sweat that had broken out across my entire body. What happened next defied all logic and reason. Without any warning, without any apparent trigger, the figure suddenly broke into a run. Not a jog or a hurried walk, but an all-out sprint directly toward the water. He plunged into the lake without hesitation, the shovel held high above his head, and began churning through the water with powerful, determined strokes. The sound of his movement through the water shattered the oppressive silence like an explosion. Waves crashed and splashed as he drove forward with inhuman determination, and I could see the white foam of his wake streaming behind him in the moonlight. He was coming directly toward me, and he was moving far faster than should have been possible for someone crossing such a large body of water. Terror finally broke my paralysis. I lurched to my feet, stumbling over the log and nearly falling as the marijuana in my system made coordination difficult. Tyler remained unconscious, completely oblivious to the approaching danger. I grabbed his shoulders and shook him violently, but he only mumbled incoherently and slumped further into his stupor. The splashing sounds were growing louder, closer. I could hear the man's labored breathing carrying across the water, a harsh rhythmic gasping that spoke of enormous physical exertion and unwavering determination. I looked back and could see him clearly now, perhaps 200 yards out and closing fast. The hood had fallen back, revealing a pale, gaunt face twisted with an expression of furious concentration. Abandoning Tyler was the hardest decision I've ever made, but survival instinct overrode everything else. I turned and ran toward the cabin, crashing through the underbrush with no concern for stealth or noise. Branches whipped across my face and tore at my clothing. but I pressed forward, driven by pure panic. Behind me, I could hear the man reach the shore. The splashing stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps on wet ground. He had made it across the lake in less than 5 minutes, an impossible feat that only added to the surreal nightmare of the situation. I reached the cabin's driveway with my lungs burning and my legs shaking from the desperate sprint through the woods. The familiar sight of our SUV provided a moment of relief, and I dove behind it, pressing my back against the cool metal and trying to control my ragged breathing. The marijuana amplified every sensation, making my heart feel like it might burst and causing every shadow to seem alive with menace. From my hiding spot, I had a clear view of the tree line where I expected the figure to emerge. I didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, he appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving with the same measured, deliberate pace he had maintained on the far shore. Up close, he was even more terrifying than at a distance. His clothes were soaked and clinging to his skeletal frame, and water dripped steadily from his hair and clothing. But it was the shovel that held my attention. Even in the poor light, I could see dark stains along its blade, and wet clumps of what looked like soil clinging to its surface. This was not a tool that had been sitting idle. It had been used recently, and used extensively. The man stopped in the center of our campsite, and slowly turned his head from side to side, scanning the area like a predator searching for prey. His movements were methodical, patient, suggesting he had all the time in the world to find what he was looking for. When his gaze swept over the SUV, I pressed myself harder against the metal, certain he would somehow sense my presence. For nearly 10 minutes he continued his search, checking behind trees, looking under the cabin's raised porch, even approaching the front door and testing the handle. Each time he moved closer to my hiding spot, I felt another piece of my sanity chip away. The waiting was almost worse than the running had been. Finally, blessedly, he seemed to give up his search. He walked to the far edge of our campsite and stood there for several more minutes, staring back toward the lake. Then, without any warning, he simply melted back into the tree line and disappeared as if he had never been there at all. I waited another full hour before I dared to move, my muscles cramped and aching from maintaining the same position for so long. When I finally crept out from behind the SUV, the campsite looked completely normal, almost peaceful in the moonlight. If not for my racing heart and sweat-soaked clothes, I might have convinced myself the entire encounter had been a drug-induced hallucination. I somehow managed to make it inside the cabin and lock every door and window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. I crawled into my bunk and lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions that had no good answers. Who was that man? What had he been digging? And most importantly, what would have happened if he had found me? Tyler stumbled back to the cabin sometime before dawn, with no memory of anything that had occurred after he had fallen asleep by the log. I wanted desperately to tell someone about what I had witnessed, but who would believe such an outlandish story? A mysterious figure crossing a huge lake in minutes, carrying a bloody shovel, hunting for victims in the night. It sounded like the ravings of someone under the influence. The rest of our vacation passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I found myself constantly watching the tree line, jumping at every unexpected sound, unable to relax or enjoy any of our traditional activities. My family noticed my change in behavior, but attributed it to typical teenage moodiness and the stress of starting a new school year. When we finally packed up to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. Relief to be escaping that cursed place, but dread about what we might be leaving behind. As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about Tyler, unconscious and vulnerable by the lake, and how easily that could have been his final resting place. In the years since that terrifying night, I have researched everything I could find about the lake and its history. What I discovered has not provided comfort. Several people have gone missing in that area over the past decade, including 2 hikers who were last seen camping near the far shore. Their bodies were never found, and the official explanation blamed wild animals or accidental drowning. But I know better. I know there is something deeply wrong with that place, something that emerges in the darkness to continue its grim work. I will never return to Pine Ridge Lake, and I pray that whatever I witnessed that night remains buried in the depths of those dark waters. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover, and some experiences are too terrible to fully understand. The image of that hooded figure and his bloody shovel continues to haunt my dreams, a reminder that evil can lurk in the most beautiful and peaceful places, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the unlucky few who stumble into its domain. I'd hiked the Smokies dozens of times, alone in groups, every way you could imagine. Greenbrier had always been one of my favorites. It wasn't crowded like Cades Cove, and it had enough wildflowers to keep my camera busy for days. As a seasoned solo hiker at 32, I knew the risks: bad weather, twisted ankles, bears. But this was the Smokies in late spring of 2021. Safe enough if you knew what you were doing, or at least that's what I believed. I parked at the Porters Creek trailhead just after sunrise on a Tuesday morning. My pack was loaded with enough gear to last 4 days. My goal was to photograph some of the more elusive wildflowers blooming high up where the trails tapered off into old logging roads. It had rained overnight and the air was still heavy, mist clinging to the mountainsides like wet cotton. The parking lot was empty except for my Subaru, which should have been my first warning. The initial miles passed quickly along well-maintained trail. Rhododendrons crowded the path, their waxy leaves still heavy with moisture. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop to photograph a particular bloom or capture the way morning light filtered through the canopy. The familiar rhythm of hiking settled over me, the steady crunch of boots on packed earth, the gentle sway of my pack, the measured breathing that comes with years of experience. By 10 a.m., I'd covered nearly 4 miles and reached the junction where the maintained trail began to fade. Here the Park Service markers grew sparse, replaced by faded blazes painted on trees decades ago. The forest felt different here, older somehow. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their massive trunks scarred by lightning and age. Moss covered everything in a thick green carpet that muffled sound until even my footsteps seemed distant and dreamlike. The silence struck me first, not the peaceful quiet of a normal forest, but something deeper, more complete. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed absent. I paused frequently, listening, but heard only my own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through leaves far above. The temperature had dropped noticeably as I climbed, and despite the warm morning, I found myself shivering. By noon, I'd left the main trails behind completely. My topographic map showed only the faintest markings, now dotted lines someone had scratched in by hand years ago. I stepped over half-hidden rusted cables, leftovers from logging crews nearly a century before. Rotted wooden planks emerged from the forest floor like bones, remnants of forgotten structures. The deeper I ventured, the more the woods seemed to reclaim every trace of human presence, as if the mountain itself were slowly digesting the past. The trail, such as it was, wound through a maze of fallen trees and rocky outcroppings. Several times I had to backtrack when the path simply vanished into impenetrable thickets. My GPS showed I was still heading generally northwest, climbing steadily toward a ridgeline that didn't appear on any modern map. The trees pressed closer here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a green tunnel that blocked most of the sky. Eventually, around 2 in the afternoon, I reached a flat spot near a creek that bubbled quietly over smooth stones. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, carpeted with soft moss, and surrounded by towering hemlocks. It felt like a natural cathedral, peaceful and secluded, perfect for setting up camp. It was quiet, cool, and comfortably isolated, or so I thought. After dropping my pack and checking my phone, no signal. The tent went up easily on the level ground. I arranged my gear methodically, hanging my food bag from a high branch to keep it away from bears, setting up my camp stove on a flat rock near the creek. The water ran clear and cold, perfect for drinking after I'd run it through my filter. As I worked, that strange silence continued to press in around me, broken only by the gentle gurgle of the stream and the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. After pitching my tent, I wandered uphill, scouting for flowers while still keeping my camp within eyesight. The slope rose steeply above the creek, covered in a thick carpet of ferns and wildflowers. Trilliums bloomed in white clusters, and I spotted several rare orchids tucked into shady crevices. I spent an hour photographing them, losing myself in the familiar pleasure of capturing nature's intricate beauty. But as the afternoon wore on, an uneasy feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Nothing I could put my finger on at first, just a sense of being observed. I'd pause in my photography to look around, scanning the forest for movement, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted though, a constant itch between my shoulder blades, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every movement. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta and sat by my small fire, watching darkness seep between the trees. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trunks, creating an ever-shifting pattern of light and dark that played tricks on my eyes. Every few minutes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there but empty forest. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline. I pulled on my fleece jacket and moved closer to the fire, feeding it with dead wood I'd gathered earlier. The crackling flames provided both warmth and comfort, but they also limited my night vision, turning everything beyond their reach into impenetrable blackness. Every snap of burning wood made me jump. Every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I tried to rationalize away my growing anxiety. Solo camping always involved some adjustment period, some natural wariness at being alone in the wilderness, but this felt different. This felt wrong. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. Even the fire seemed smaller somehow, its light failing to push back the encroaching darkness as much as it should. When I finally retreated to my tent around 10 p.m., I double-checked every zipper, making sure everything was sealed tight. I placed my hiking boots beside my sleeping bag, within easy reach. My headlamp went on the left side, my knife on the right. Old habits from years of solo camping, but tonight they felt more like desperate precautions than simple organization. I lay awake for what felt like hours, every sense hyper-alert. The thin nylon walls of my tent felt ridiculously inadequate, offering no real protection against whatever might be lurking in the darkness outside. Every sound seemed amplified. The whisper of wind through branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of settling wood. But underneath it all was that persistent silence, that sense of something holding itself perfectly still, perfectly quiet, just beyond the range of my hearing. Sometime after midnight, I must have finally drifted off because I woke with a start to complete silence. No wind, no owl calls, nothing. The darkness inside my tent was absolute, thick enough to feel solid against my face. I fumbled for my headlamp, clicking it on with trembling fingers. The beam revealed my tent's interior exactly as I'd left it, but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence outside was different now, more intentional, as if something had been moving through the forest and had suddenly stopped. I listened intently, holding my breath, but heard nothing except my own rapid heartbeat pounding in my ears. I clicked off the headlamp and lay back down, but couldn't return to restful sleep. The remainder of the night passed in fitful dozing, punctuated by moments of sharp alertness when some small sound would jerk me awake. Each time I'd lie there listening, heart racing, until exhaustion would pull me back under. When morning finally came, pale and gray, I crawled out of the tent with every muscle aching from tension. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it the night before, but something was wrong. It took me several minutes to pinpoint what was bothering me, and when I finally realized what it was, my stomach dropped like a stone. A small camping trowel I had left out near my cook stove was missing. But that wasn't what sent fear crawling up my spine like ice water. It was the single unfamiliar boot print, pressed deeply into the mud beside the cold fire pit. It was larger than mine, and shaped differently, like a heavy old-fashioned work boot with deep treads I didn't recognize. I knelt beside the print, studying it in the pale morning light. The impression was clear and fresh, made sometime during the night while I slept. But what terrified me most was its position. Whoever had made it had been standing directly beside my tent, close enough to touch the nylon walls, close enough to hear my breathing inside. I searched frantically around the campsite, looking for other signs of intrusion, but found nothing. No disturbed gear, no other footprints, no indication that anyone had touched anything else. Just that single boot print, perfectly preserved in the soft mud, proof that I hadn't been alone in the darkness after all. My hands shook as I started the camp stove and boiled water for coffee. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to pack up and leave immediately, but daylight had restored some measure of rationality. The forest had regained its normal sounds, birds chirping tentatively in the canopy, the distant chatter of a squirrel, the gentle whisper of morning breeze through leaves. In the growing light, the boot print seemed less menacing, more explainable. Probably another hiker, I told myself, though the rationalization felt hollow. It was odd that someone would pass through here unnoticed. especially in the middle of the night, but not impossible. The forest had a habit of swallowing sound. Maybe I'd slept deeper than usual. Maybe they'd been trying not to disturb me and accidentally dropped something, prompting them to search around my campsite in the darkness. Determined to put it from my mind, I grabbed my camera gear and set off back toward the slope where I'd been photographing wildflowers the previous afternoon. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and growing things. Dew clung to every surface, turning spider webs into strings of diamonds, and making the forest sparkle like something from a fairy tale. I spent an hour working my way uphill, photographing the intricate patterns of light and shadow that danced through the canopy. The physical activity helped calm my nerves, and the familiar routine of adjusting camera settings and composing shots provided a welcome distraction from my growing unease. But as I climbed higher, that strange silence began to return, gradually replacing the normal forest sounds until I was once again surrounded by an oppressive quiet. Maybe half a mile from my tent, hidden among ferns and patches of moss, I found something that made me stop cold. At first glance, I mistook it for a natural formation, stones arranged by water erosion or wind. But as I drew closer, it became obvious they had been stacked carefully by human hands. Large river rocks formed a rough circle about 6 feet across, with smaller stones arranged in neat rows inside the perimeter. In the center of this primitive monument, a splintered, rotted wooden cross had been driven deep into the earth. The wood was dark with age and moisture, covered in patches of green moss and orange lichen. Most of the original surface had weathered away, leaving only the rough grain and a few deep gouges that might once have been carved letters. I knelt beside the marker, studying it closely. An old grave, undoubtedly from back when the loggers lived and worked in these mountains. I'd heard they sometimes buried their dead close to the camps, creating crude memorials that lasted long after the men who placed them were forgotten. There were no names visible on the cross, no dates, no identifying marks beyond those mysterious gouges that time had rendered illegible. The stones around the cross showed signs of recent disturbance. Some had been moved from their original positions, rearranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher. Fresh scratches marked several of the larger rocks as if they'd been dragged across rough ground. Most disturbing of all, the earth around the base of the cross had been disturbed, leaving a depression that looked suspiciously like it had been dug and then hastily filled in again. I stood up quickly, suddenly eager to be away from this place. There was something deeply unsettling about finding evidence of recent activity at what should have been an undisturbed historical site. Who would come all the way up here to disturb an old grave, and why? I took a quick photo on my phone out of curiosity, then turned and started back toward camp. But as I began to descend the slope, a sound made me freeze in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the forest floor somewhere behind me. I spun around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing except shadows and undergrowth. The footsteps stopped the moment I turned. I waited, holding my breath, listening intently. Nothing, but I could feel something watching me, studying me from the concealment of the forest. My skin crawled with the sensation of invisible eyes tracking my every movement. "Hello?" I called out, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is someone there?" The forest didn't answer. There were no more footsteps, no cracking branches, just the silence of woods that felt suddenly horribly alive with hidden presence. A wave of primitive fear washed over me, the kind of terror our ancestors must have felt when they sensed predators lurking just beyond the reach of firelight. I tried not to dwell on it as I hurried back toward camp. This was Appalachia, after all. Old graves were scattered throughout these mountains, fading reminders of lives spent in these remote hollows. And as for the footsteps, well, sound played tricks in the forest. Probably just my own echo bouncing off the trees. But deep down, I didn't believe my own explanations. Not for a second. The rest of that morning passed without incident. I forced myself to maintain a normal routine, eating a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit, organizing my gear, checking my equipment. The familiar tasks helped steady my nerves, and by noon I'd almost convinced myself that I was overreacting to what were probably perfectly natural circumstances. But when I returned to my tent after a brief hike to photograph some unusual fungi I'd spotted growing on a fallen log, my carefully constructed sense of normalcy shattered completely. My backpack, the one I'd left securely zipped inside my tent, now rested neatly atop the old grave marker I'd discovered earlier. The pack sat perfectly upright, straps arranged carefully as though placed there with deliberate reverence. My camera, which I'd left inside the pack, hung from its strap around the rotted wooden cross like some kind of offering. I stared at the scene for a full minute, rooted in place, the trees seeming to close around me like the walls of a trap. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. The grave was over half a mile from my campsite, up a steep slope, hidden among dense undergrowth. There was no way my pack could have ended up there by accident. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time, letting desperation creep into my voice. "I know you're out there. What do you want?" The forest didn't answer. There were no footsteps, no movement, just the silence of woods that felt suddenly horribly familiar, as if this silence had been waiting for me, had been planning this moment since I first set foot on the trail. I approached the grave marker slowly, every nerve screaming at me to run. The pack appeared undamaged, its contents intact as far as I could tell. But the implications of finding it here, arranged so carefully, sent waves of nausea washing through my stomach. Someone had entered my tent while I was away, removed my pack, and carried it here. Someone who knew the forest well enough to move through it without leaving a trace. Someone who had been watching me closely enough to know my routines, my schedule, my vulnerabilities. I snatched the pack and camera off the stones, checking quickly to make sure everything was there. Nothing seemed to be missing, but everything felt contaminated somehow, as if invisible hands had touched every item, examined every piece of my gear with careful attention. The walk back to camp felt like a death march. Every shadow might conceal a watching figure, every rustle of leaves might herald an attack. I found myself moving faster and faster, almost running by the time I reached the clearing where my tent waited. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Tent zippers were still secured exactly as I'd left them, sleeping bags still neatly arranged inside. My remaining gear showed no signs of tampering, but the absence of additional disturbance somehow made things worse, not better. It meant whoever was doing this had surgical precision, moving through my campsite with expert care, taking only what they wanted, touching only what served their purpose. For a long time I stood there breathing too fast, ears straining for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. 100 explanations swirled through my head, but none made sense. I was miles from any established trail, miles from any other campers. If there had been another hiker in the area, why hadn't they announced themselves? Why move my belongings? Why the elaborate staging at the gravesite? The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. I tried to maintain normal activities, but found it impossible to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes. Every bird call made me jump. Every whisper of wind through the leaves sounded like footsteps. I caught myself scanning the forest constantly, searching for movement, for any sign of the presence I could feel watching me. As evening approached, I faced a terrible decision. I didn't want to stay another night, but hiking out in darkness along barely visible trails would be suicide. The smart thing to do would be to prepare for another night in camp, but the thought of lying helpless in my tent while invisible hands moved freely through the darkness made my skin crawl. I compromised by setting up defensive measures that felt pathetic even as I implemented them. I strung fishing line between trees around my campsite at ankle height, hoping it might trip up anyone approaching in the darkness. I arranged empty cans around my tent as makeshift alarm bells. I even considered staying awake all night, but knew that would leave me exhausted and vulnerable the next day. As darkness fell and I retreated to my tent, one terrible certainty had crystallized in my mind. I was not alone in these woods. Someone else was moving unseen through the forest. Someone who knew the land better than I did. Someone who had already demonstrated they could reach me whenever they wanted. Someone who had been inside my tent while I slept, close enough to hear my breathing, close enough to touch my face. That night passed like a fever dream. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. Around midnight, one of my improvised alarms went off, a can rattling against a tree branch. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, sweeping the beam around the campsite. Nothing, just shadows and empty forest, innocent and still. But when I retreated back into the tent, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh mud on the tent's exterior, right where someone might have knelt to peer through the thin nylon walls. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Whoever was out there had been close enough to watch me sleep, close enough to see my every movement through the illuminated fabric. I didn't close my eyes again that night. When dawn finally broke, cold and gray, I discovered that my defensive measures had been systematically dismantled. The fishing line lay neatly coiled beside my tent. The warning cans had been carefully removed and stacked in a tidy pile. But most terrifying of all, the tent flap I'd triple-checked before bed was unzipped halfway to the ground. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, panic sharp in my chest, searching frantically for any sign someone had been inside. Everything appeared untouched, but then I noticed my hiking boots. I'd placed them beside my sleeping bag before bed, deliberately close for quick access. Now they sat outside the tent entrance, side by side, positioned carefully with military precision. They were pointing down the narrow path that led deeper into the woods, away from any established trail, toward the heart of the mountain's most remote wilderness. My heart hammered against my ribs, sending blood pounding through my temples hard enough to make me dizzy. I knew with absolute certainty I hadn't arranged my boots this way. Someone had unzipped my tent, reached inches from my sleeping face and moved them outside, all without making a sound loud enough to wake me. The realization that I'd slept through such an intimate violation left me shaking with a combination of terror and rage. How long had they been inside my tent? What else had they done while I lay there unconscious and vulnerable? As I stepped cautiously outside, the smell of smoke hit me like a slap. My camp stove sat on its usual rock, flame burning blue beneath a small pot of bubbling water. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the mineral scent of creek water heated to a rolling boil. My stomach twisted violently. I knew I'd turned off the stove completely before bed. Someone had restarted it, gathered fresh water from the creek and set it to boil while I slept mere feet away. But why? What possible purpose could it serve except to demonstrate their complete power over my situation? I spun around, scanning the forest desperately for any sign of movement, any glimpse of whoever was playing this sick game. "I know you're there," I screamed, my voice echoing off the surrounding ridges. "What do you want from me?" Silence, but not the normal silence of empty woods. This was the silence of something listening, something waiting just beyond the edge of visibility. I could feel eyes on me, studying my every reaction, measuring my fear. That was when I saw him. Movement flickered at the edge of the clearing, so subtle I almost missed it. A figure stood motionless between two large oaks, partially concealed by shadows but unmistakably human, tall and lean, wearing strange clothes that seemed to belong to another century. Heavy wool trousers held up by suspenders, a canvas shirt darkened with age and wear, a shapeless hat pulled low over a face I couldn't make out in the dim light. He didn't move when I spotted him, didn't try to hide or retreat, just stood there watching me with an intensity I could feel even across the distance separating us. In one hand he held what looked like a walking stick, but as my eyes adjusted I realized it was something far more sinister. A long wooden bow, the kind hunters might have used generations ago. "Who are you?" I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What do you want?" For a moment he remained perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and forest gloom. Then, without any sudden movement, he simply wasn't there anymore. 1 second I was staring directly at him, the next there was only empty space between the oak trees. I blinked hard, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the image remained burned into my memory with crystal clarity. The way he'd stood with complete stillness, perfect balance. The old-fashioned clothes that looked handmade, hand-worn, most disturbing of all, the sense that he'd been watching me for far longer than I'd been aware of his presence. This wasn't a fellow hiker who'd stumbled across my campsite. This was someone who belonged to these mountains in a way I never could. Someone who moved through the forest like it was his natural habitat. Someone who'd been hunting me since the moment I'd set foot on his territory. I needed to get out, immediately. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever game this stranger was playing. But when I reached into my pack for my topographic map, planning the fastest route back to the trailhead, a sickening emptiness greeted my fingers. The map was gone. Panic surged through me like electricity, hot and immediate. Without the map, I was essentially lost in thousands of acres of wilderness. I knew the general direction back to the main trail, but in this maze of ridges and valleys, a wrong turn could lead me deeper into the mountains instead of out. I dumped my pack completely, spreading everything on the ground, checking and rechecking every pocket and compartment. No map. Someone had taken it, probably the same person who'd moved my boots, who'd lit my stove, who'd been creeping around my tent in the darkness. The message was clear. I wasn't going anywhere he didn't want me to go, fighting down the hysteria that threatened to overwhelm me. I tried to think rationally about my situation. I had my phone, though it showed no signal bars. I had a basic compass. I had enough food and water for another day, maybe two if I rationed carefully. Most importantly, I had years of hiking experience and a good sense of direction. I could find my way out. I had to. Grabbing what gear I could carry, I stuffed everything hastily into my pack, shouldered it, and set off downhill. Moving fast at first, I crashed through undergrowth and scrambled over fallen logs, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing where invisible eyes had watched my every move. But the forest seemed determined to confuse me. Trails that looked promising petered out into impenetrable thickets. Ridgelines that should have led downhill toward the main valley instead curved back on themselves, depositing me right back where I'd started. After 2 hours of increasingly frantic hiking, I realized with growing horror that I was completely lost. Every direction looked the same. The dense canopy blocked most of the sky, making it impossible to navigate by the sun. My compass spun uselessly, apparently affected by some local magnetic interference I'd never encountered before. Even the creek I'd been following seemed to change direction randomly, flowing uphill in some places, disappearing entirely in others. As afternoon faded toward evening, exhaustion forced me to stop. I'd covered miles without making any real progress, and my water was running dangerously low. The smart thing to do was find shelter for the night and start fresh in the morning. But the thought of spending another night in these woods knowing I was being watched filled me with a terror so deep it made my hands shake. I found a small depression beneath a cluster of evergreens, a natural shelter that offered some protection from the wind. I didn't dare light a fire that would only advertise my location to whatever was stalking me through the darkness. Instead, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and hunkered down to wait for dawn. The woods around me came alive as darkness fell, not with normal forest sounds, but with subtle movements that raised every hair on my neck. Branches creaking in patterns that seemed deliberate. Footsteps that stopped the moment I turned to listen. The whisper of something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the range of my vision. I gripped my headlamp in one hand and my knife in the other, straining every sense for signs of approaching danger. Hours crawled by like days, each minute stretching endlessly in the oppressive darkness. My eyes burned from staring into the shadows. My ears rang from listening so intently to every tiny sound. Sometime long past midnight, the forest fell completely silent. No wind, no insect calls, nothing. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. And in that silence I heard something that turned my blood to ice water. Humming. Someone was humming a tune I didn't recognize, a low, mournful melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound drifted through the trees like fog, impossible to localize, impossible to ignore. I clicked on my headlamp, sweeping the beam frantically through the surrounding forest. Nothing. Just empty trees and hollow shadows that seemed to mock my terror. But the humming continued, growing slightly louder, as if whoever was making it was slowly circling my hiding place. Then I saw movement, a figure stepping carefully between the trees, just at the edge of my light's reach. The same tall, lean shape I'd glimpsed at my campsite, but clearer now. I could see his face beneath the brim of his hat, weathered skin stretched tight over sharp bones, eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. He carried his bow in one hand, an arrow nocked and ready, but he wasn't hunting animals. He was hunting me. "Please," I whispered, though I doubt he could hear me over the sound of my hammering heart. "I don't know what you want. I'm just trying to leave." He stopped humming, stopped walking. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, studying me with those gleaming eyes. Then, without making a sound, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that contained no trace of human warmth. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about territory or trespassing. This was about sport. I was prey, and he was enjoying the hunt. The moment our eyes met, something primal kicked in, the same survival instinct that had kept my ancestors alive in far more dangerous times. I rolled sideways out of my sleeping bag and bolted into the darkness, crashing through undergrowth with no thought for direction or stealth. Behind me, I heard no pursuit, no breaking branches or pounding footsteps, just that terrible silence which was somehow worse than any sound of chase would have been. It meant he was confident. It meant he knew these woods well enough to track me without effort, to anticipate where I would go before I knew myself. I ran blindly through the forest, guided only by my headlamp's narrow beam and the desperate hope that I was moving toward safety rather than deeper into his territory. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, leaving bloody scratches across my face and arms. My pack bounced against my back with every step, throwing off my balance and slowing my progress. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as I stumbled through the darkness. Steep ravines opened without warning beneath my feet. Hidden logs sent me sprawling face first into the forest floor. Thorny vines caught at my legs like grasping fingers trying to drag me down. But terror drove me forward. Every time I paused to catch my breath, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, that awful humming drifting through the trees. He was following me, staying just close enough to keep me moving. Never close enough to be seen clearly. Dawn found me collapsed beside a different creek, my water bottles empty, my body pushed far beyond its limits. Blood streaked my hands and face from dozens of cuts. My left ankle throbbed from a twist I'd gotten stumbling over a fallen log. But I was alive, and as gray light began to filter through the canopy, I allowed myself a moment of desperate hope. Maybe I'd lost him in the darkness. Maybe the daylight would reveal a clear path back to civilization. Maybe this nightmare was finally ending. That hope died quickly. As I knelt beside the creek, splashing cold water on my torn face, I became aware of eyes watching me from across the stream. He stood motionless among the trees on the far bank, no longer bothering to hide. In the pale morning light, I could see him clearly for the first time. His clothes were old but well-maintained, hand-stitched wool and canvas that spoke of a simpler time. His face was ageless in the way of people who'd spent their lives outdoors, weathered but strong. But his eyes held a hunger that made me understand why apex predators had been feared by humans since the dawn of time. This wasn't a man who'd gotten lost in the woods and gone feral. This was something that had always lived here. Something that saw the forest as his domain, and me as an unwelcome intruder who needed to be dealt with. He raised his bow slowly, drawing the string back with practiced ease. The arrow's point caught the morning light, sharp enough to punch through my chest and pin me to the tree behind me. At this range, he couldn't possibly miss. "Wait," I gasped, though I had no idea what I was asking him to wait for. "Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back. I'll never tell anyone about this place." For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then that cold smile returned, and I realized my mistake. He didn't want me to leave. This was never about protecting his territory. This was about the hunt, about the game, about having prey worthy of his skills. He'd been alone in these mountains for God knows how long, and I was the most interesting thing to happen to him in years. The bowstring released with a soft twang. I threw myself sideways just as the arrow buried itself in the creek bank where I'd been kneeling. Before he could knock another arrow, I was running again, crashing through the forest with renewed desperation. This time I heard him coming after me. Not the heavy footfalls of a city dweller stumbling through unfamiliar terrain, but the whisper-quiet movement of someone who belonged here, who could move through the forest like water flowing downhill. I ran for hours, driven by pure terror, stumbling and falling and picking myself up again. My body was failing, legs cramping, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. But somewhere ahead, the forest was getting brighter. The trees were thinning. I could smell something different in the air, something that spoke of roads and cars and civilization. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto a paved road, the relief was so overwhelming I collapsed immediately, sobbing with exhaustion and gratitude. A Park Service truck was parked at a nearby pullout, and a ranger was climbing out, radio in hand. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She rushed toward me, taking in my bloody, torn condition. "We've been looking for you. Your car's been at the Porters Creek trailhead for 3 days. 3 days. Had I really been in there that long? Time had lost all meaning in the endless cycle of terror and exhaustion. "There's someone in there," I gasped between sobs. "He's hunting me. He has a bow. He took my map." The ranger's expression grew concerned, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. "Ma'am, let's get you to a hospital first. Then we can talk about what happened." As they loaded me into the truck, I looked back at the forest one final time, and there, barely visible among the trees, I saw him watching, still as stone, patient as death itself. Our eyes met across the distance, and he nodded once. A gesture that somehow conveyed both respect for my escape and promise of what would happen if I ever returned. The search team found my abandoned campsite exactly as I described it. Tent collapsed, gear scattered, signs of extended occupation but no evidence of another person. They recovered my missing map from beneath a pile of leaves near the old grave marker, though they couldn't explain how it had gotten there. Most of my missing equipment turned up eventually, carefully arranged in clearings throughout the forest like offerings at various shrines. But they found no trace of the man I'd described. No unusual footprints, no signs of another camp, no evidence that anyone else had been in the area. The official report listed me as a hiker who'd become disoriented and panicked, possibly suffering from dehydration-induced hallucinations. I let them believe it. What was the alternative? Tell them about a man who moved through the forest like a ghost, who could track prey for days without leaving a trace, who treated the wilderness like his personal hunting preserve. They'd have assumed I was suffering from some kind of breakdown, but I knew what I'd experienced. The scratches on my arms were real. The terror that still woke me in cold sweats was real, and most real of all was the memory of those predators' eyes studying me across the creek, measuring me like a hunter measures prey. I never returned to the Smokies. In fact, I never went hiking alone again. The wilderness I'd once loved now seemed full of shadows and hidden watchers, of places where ancient hunts might still be playing out according to rules I couldn't understand. Sometimes, late at night, I'd research old stories about the area. Mountain men who'd never left the woods when civilization moved in. Loggers who'd disappeared during the railroad days and were never found. Hunters who'd gone into the forest and simply vanished as if the mountains themselves had swallowed them. The stories were fragmentary, inconsistent, probably mostly folklore. But they all shared certain themes. Isolated men who'd lived in the wilderness so long they'd become part of it, who'd developed skills that bordered on supernatural, who'd forgotten how to be human and remembered only how to hunt. 3 months after my escape from Greenbrier, I received a package at my home address. No return label, no postmark indicating its origin. Inside was my missing camping trowel, the one that had disappeared on my first night. It had been cleaned and sharpened, maintained with obvious care. Wrapped around the handle was a single piece of twine, tied in an intricate knot I didn't recognize. The message was clear. He knew where I lived. He could reach me whenever he wanted, but for now the game was over. I'd provided enough sport to satisfy him, and he was returning my equipment as a gesture of respect between hunter and prey. I kept the trowel in a drawer, where it serves as a reminder of how thin the line really is between civilization and wilderness, between the safe modern world and the ancient hungers that still stalk through the forgotten places of the earth. The mountains remember. They remember when humans were prey, when the forest held terrors that couldn't be explained by science or rational thought. They remember the old rules, the old hunts, the old bargains between predator and prey. And sometimes, if you venture deep enough into the wild places, you might find that the mountains haven't forgotten how to hunt. I learned something important during those 3 days in Greenbrier. There are still corners of the world where different rules apply, where different kinds of people live by different codes. The man I'd encountered wasn't evil, exactly. He was just following a pattern older than civilization, older than cities, older than the idea that humans should be safe from the things that hunt in the dark. He was a reminder of what we'd once been, and what we might become again if we stayed too long in places where the modern world holds no sway. As I write this 5 years later, I still dream about those eyes watching me from across the creek. Still wake up sometimes convinced I can hear that lonely humming drifting through the darkness outside my window. The rational part of my mind insists it was trauma, that my memories have been distorted by fear and time. But late at night when the house settles around me and the darkness presses against the windows, I remember the weight of his gaze and the certainty that somewhere in the Smokies, in places no map will ever mark, the hunt continues. And I'm grateful every single day that I was fast enough, lucky enough, or perhaps just entertaining enough to escape with nothing more than scars and memories. Some games you're not meant to win. Sometimes survival is victory enough. I remember that trip like it was yesterday. Not because it was the most beautiful place I'd ever been, but because it changed everything for me. I don't hike anymore. Not since that weekend in 1998. And I definitely don't trust people the same way I used to. It started as a simple idea, one of those last-minute decisions you make when you're tired of the same old routine. I had a long weekend, and I hadn't taken any time for myself in months. A hike seemed perfect. Fresh air, trees, quiet. I needed it. My plan was to drive up to the Cascade Mountains, spend 3 days on the trail, and come back feeling like a new person. That was the plan, anyway. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, and a few bottles of water. My destination was a less traveled route called Gray Slope Ridge. It wasn't too far from the more popular trails, but just remote enough that it never saw much foot traffic. Perfect for getting away from everything. The drive up was uneventful. Just me and my old truck bouncing along the dirt roads surrounded by pine trees that stretched up like green spears into the sky. I reached the trailhead around noon, parked my truck, and set off with a sense of excitement. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel like you could keep walking forever. About 4 hours into the hike, I came across something strange. There was this old rusted-out car just off the side of the trail, hidden partially by overgrowth. It was one of those 70s sedans, the kind with big chrome bumpers and heavy metal doors. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades. There was no road nearby and no obvious reason why a car would be out here in the middle of nowhere. The whole scene felt off, but I shrugged it off. Weird things happen in the woods. People get lost, abandon their cars, and move on. It didn't seem worth worrying about. I kept hiking until dusk. I found a spot just off the trail to set up camp near a small creek. As I was pitching my tent, I noticed that it was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. But again, I brushed it off. Being alone out in nature can do strange things to your mind. After dinner, I climbed into my sleeping bag and drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, almost like whispering, but not quite, more like murmuring. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened closer, it didn't sound natural. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. You hear things when you're alone in the dark, right? The next day, I decided to hike a little farther off the trail. There were supposed to be some great views from the ridge, and I wanted to see them before heading back. The weather was perfect, the kind of bright, crisp day you dream about when you're stuck in an office. But something felt off. The trees seemed wrong somehow. I can't explain it. It was like they were leaning in just a little too much, like they were closing in on me. About midday, I found something else. It was an old cabin, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. There wasn't any indication it had been used recently. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. I walked closer, curiosity getting the better of me. I didn't expect to find anything, maybe just some old tools or furniture left behind. But what I found made my skin crawl. Inside, there were these strange markings all over the walls, carved into the wood. They weren't letters or symbols I recognized, just jagged lines and shapes that didn't make any sense. And there were bones, animal bones mostly, scattered on the floor. But then I saw something else, something worse. In the corner of the cabin, half buried under debris, was a human skull. I froze. It didn't make sense. How could this be here? And why had no one reported it? I backed out of the cabin, my heart pounding, and decided right then and there to head back to my truck. I wasn't about to wait around to find out who or what had left that skull there. I was maybe 2 hours into my hike back when I heard it again, the murmuring. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from all around me, as if the trees themselves were whispering. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my nerves get the better of me. Then I heard footsteps, not mine, someone else's. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around. No one was there, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were steady, deliberate, coming closer. Panic set in. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. I just needed to get out of there. But the footsteps followed. They weren't running, just walking, calmly, like whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where I was going. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing, panting, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw him. At the edge of the clearing stood a man, tall and thin, with clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks, maybe months. His face was gaunt, sunken in like he hadn't eaten in days. But it was his eyes that really got me. They were hollow, empty, like there was nothing behind them. No soul, no humanity. He just stood there watching me, his head tilted slightly to one side. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stared. I shouted at him, something. I don't even remember what. But he didn't respond. He just smiled, this thin, crooked smile that made my blood run cold. Then without a word he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't wait to see where he went. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the trail. The sun was setting, and I didn't want to be out there after dark. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be right behind me, but he wasn't. When I finally reached my truck, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there like my life depended on it. But as I drove down the winding dirt road, something caught my eye. In my rearview mirror, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. His smile was gone, replaced by something else, something darker. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, my hands shaking on the wheel. I wanted to go to the police, to tell them what I'd seen, but what was I going to say? That I'd found a skull in an old cabin and a creepy guy had followed me. It didn't seem real, even to me, so I kept quiet. I'd tried to move on, to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. A few weeks later, I saw a news report. A hiker had gone missing in the same area. They never found his body, just his tent, abandoned by the trail. The authorities said it was probably an accident, that he'd gotten lost or hurt and couldn't make it out. But I knew better. I never went back to the mountains after that. I couldn't. Whatever was out there, whatever I'd seen, it wasn't finished. Not yet. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that murmuring in the back of my mind, like it's calling me back, daring me to return. But I won't. Not ever. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I became more cautious, more skeptical of the world around me. I started to notice things I'd never paid attention to before, the way people looked at each other, the subtle shifts in their expressions, the hidden meanings behind their words. I threw myself into my work, trying to keep busy, to keep my mind off what had happened. But it was always there, lurking in the background. I'd catch myself staring out the window, wondering if he was out there somewhere watching me. I started researching the area, digging through old newspaper archives and local history books. I found stories, legends really, about people going missing in those mountains. Some dating back decades, even centuries. Most were written off as accidents or animal attacks, but there was always something that didn't quite add up. I reached out to other hikers, people who'd been to Gray Slope Ridge. Most had nothing unusual to report, but a few had stories. They talked about feeling watched, about hearing strange noises in the night. One guy swore he'd seen someone or something moving through the trees, just at the edge of his vision. I started to piece together a pattern. The disappearances, the sightings, they all seemed to cluster around certain times of the year. The fall equinox, the winter solstice, dates that had significance in ancient cultures. But the more I dug, the more questions I had. Who was that man in the woods? Was he connected to the skull I found? And what about those markings in the cabin? What did they mean? I became obsessed, spending hours poring over maps, cross-referencing dates and locations. I started to see connections everywhere, even in places where there probably weren't any. My friends worried about me, said I was becoming paranoid. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't let it go. I felt like I was on the edge of uncovering something big, something important. But every time I thought I was getting close, the trail would go cold. I started having nightmares. I'd be back in those woods running from something I couldn't see. I'd hear that murmuring again, louder this time, almost like words but in a language I couldn't understand. And always I'd see those eyes, hollow and empty, watching me from the darkness. I tried therapy, tried medication, but nothing seemed to help. The dreams, the fear, they were always there, just below the surface. Years passed. I moved away, trying to put some distance between myself and those mountains. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed, that something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I'd see news reports about hikers going missing, about strange sightings in remote areas, and I'd wonder, Was it happening elsewhere too? Was whatever I'd encountered in those woods spreading? I started connecting with others who'd had similar experiences. We formed a sort of support group, sharing our stories, our theories. Some thought it was all coincidence, just the result of overactive imaginations and the inherent dangers of the wilderness. Others had wilder ideas, government conspiracies, supernatural entities, things I couldn't bring myself to believe. But as I listened to their stories, I started to see patterns. The same themes kept coming up: the feeling of being watched, the strange markings, the sense that the forest itself was alive and hostile. I began to wonder if what I'd experienced was part of something larger, something that had been going on for far longer than I'd realized. Maybe those ancient legends weren't just stories. Maybe there was some truth to them, some warning that we'd forgotten or ignored. I found myself drawn back to the mountains, not physically, but mentally. I'd spend hours studying satellite images, looking for anything unusual. I'd track weather patterns, lunar cycles, anything that might give me a clue. And then, about 5 years after my encounter, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A news article about a forest fire in the Cascades, near Gray Slope Ridge. The fire had revealed something: the foundations of an old settlement, one that predated any known European exploration of the area. Archaeologists were baffled. The structures didn't match any known Native American building techniques. And there were markings, carved into stone pillars. Markings that looked eerily similar to what I'd seen in that old cabin. I wanted to go back, to see for myself, but I couldn't. The fear was still too strong. Instead, I reached out to the archaeologists, sharing what I knew, what I'd seen. Most dismissed me as a crackpot, but a few listened. They asked questions, seemed genuinely interested. For a while, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this would be the key to understanding what had happened to me, what was still happening in those mountains. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whole thing was shut down. The site was closed off, declared too dangerous due to potential landslides. I tried to follow up to find out what had happened, but I hit wall after wall. The archaeologists I'd spoken to suddenly couldn't be reached. The news articles about the discovery disappeared from the internet. It was like it had never happened, and that's when I realized, whatever was out there, whatever I'd stumbled upon, it was bigger than I'd ever imagined. There were forces at work that didn't want this discovered, didn't want the truth to come out. I backed off after that. I stopped my research, stopped reaching out to others. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was seeing patterns where there were none. But deep down, I knew that what I'd seen was real, and that it was still out there. Now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I see a news report about a missing hiker, every time I hear about strange sightings in the wilderness, I wonder, is it happening again? Is it spreading? I don't have answers. I don't know if I ever will, but I know this. There's something out there in those woods, something old and patient and dangerous, and it's waiting for people like me, people who stumble into its domain, unaware of the ancient forces they're dealing with. So I stay away from the mountains now. I avoid the forests, the wild places, and I warn others when I can, tell them to be careful, to trust their instincts. Because sometimes the legends are true, sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they're watching us from just beyond the tree line, waiting for their chance to strike. My name is Thomas Martinez. I'm 54 years old, and I've been a search and rescue officer for the United States Forest Service for nearly 2 decades. The mountains, trees, and wilderness are as familiar to me as the back of my hand. But no matter how well you know a place, it can still surprise you. Sometimes, those surprises are not the kind you want. It was a crisp autumn morning when I got the call. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape. I was sipping my first cup of coffee, savoring the quiet moments before the day truly began. The sharp ring of my phone cut through the stillness, and I felt a familiar twinge of anxiety. Early morning calls rarely brought good news in my line of work. "Martinez," I answered, my voice still rough with sleep. "Thomas, it's Ranger Wilson," came the urgent reply. "We've got a situation. A hiker's gone missing overnight on the Appalachian Trail." I felt my muscles tense as I listened to the details. The missing hiker, a man named Michael Lawson, had set out on a solo trek the previous morning. He was an experienced outdoorsman, well-versed in the trails and equipped for a day hike. But when night fell and he hadn't returned, his wife, Valerie, raised the alarm. "I'm on my way," I told Wilson, already moving to grab my gear. "Have you set up a base at the trailhead?" "Yes." "Affirmative. Valerie's here too. She's pretty shaken up." I hung up and quickly dressed, my mind already running through scenarios and strategies. The Appalachian Trail was vast and unforgiving. Even experienced hikers could find themselves in trouble if they strayed from the path or encountered unexpected obstacles. And with each passing hour, the chances of finding Michael alive diminished. As I drove to the trailhead, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about this felt different from our usual search and rescue operations. Maybe it was the early morning mist that clung to the trees, or the way the shadows seemed to deepen as I approached the mountains. Whatever it was, it set my nerves on edge. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun had fully risen, bathing the area in a deceptively cheerful light. A small group had gathered near the ranger's truck, a mix of other search and rescue personnel and a few local volunteers. And there, standing apart from the others, was a woman I assumed to be Valerie Lawson. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, evidence of a sleepless night spent worrying. As I approached, she looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear that I'd seen countless times before. "Mrs. Lawson?" I said gently. "I'm Thomas Martinez, Search and Rescue." She nodded, clutching a worn photograph in her hands. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to find him." I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can, Mrs. Lawson. Can you tell me a bit more about your husband? Any specific areas he likes to explore, or places he might have gone off trail?" As Valerie spoke, I studied the photograph she held. Michael Lawson looked to be about my age, with a sturdy build and a broad, friendly smile. He had the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. In the picture, he stood atop a mountain peak, arms raised in triumph. "Michael knows these trails like the back of his hand," Valerie was saying. "He's hiked them dozens of times. I don't understand how this could have happened." I nodded sympathetically. "Even experienced hikers can run into trouble, Mrs. Lawson. But that experience also gives them the skills to survive until we find them. Now, can you show me exactly where Michael planned to hike yesterday?" We moved to a large map spread out on the hood of the ranger's truck. Valerie traced Michael's intended route with a shaking finger. It was a challenging trail, but nothing out of the ordinary for someone of his skill level. As I studied the map, Ranger Wilson approached. "We've got teams ready to head out, Thomas. What's the plan?" I outlined our search strategy, dividing the area into grids and assigning teams to each section. "Remember," I told the assembled group, "Michael is an experienced hiker. He knows to stay put if he's injured or lost. Keep your eyes open for any signs of a campsite or shelter he might have made." With our plan in place, I turned back to Valerie. "Mrs. Lawson, I promise you we're going to do everything in our power to bring Michael home safely. The best thing you can do now is to stay here at base camp. We'll keep you updated on our progress." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please find him," she whispered. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze before turning to gather my gear. As I shouldered my pack and checked my radio, I couldn't shake the feeling that this search was going to be different. The forest seemed to loom before me, its shadows deeper and more menacing than I'd ever noticed before. With a deep breath, I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a job to do, and a man's life depended on my focus and skill. I set off down the trail, the sounds of the forest enveloping me as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. The Appalachian Trail stretched out before me, a narrow ribbon of earth winding through the dense forest. The early morning sun filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow on the ground. In any other circumstance, it would have been beautiful. But today, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every rustle in the undergrowth a possible clue to Michael Lawson's whereabouts. I moved at a steady pace, my eyes constantly scanning the trail and the surrounding forest. Years of experience had taught me to look for the subtle signs that most people would miss. A broken twig, a scuff mark in the dirt, anything out of place in the natural order of things. "Michael," I called out periodically, my voice echoing through the trees. "Michael Lawson, if you can hear me, call out or make a noise." But the only response was the chirping of birds and the whisper of wind through the leaves. As I hiked, I kept in radio contact with the other search teams, but so far, no one had found any sign of our missing hiker. After about an hour on the trail, I came to a fork. According to the map, Michael's planned route took the left path, which led up to a scenic overlook. But something made me pause. There, barely visible in the soft earth, was a footprint. It was partially obscured, but it seemed to be pointing towards the right-hand path. I crouched down to examine it more closely. The tread pattern matched the description of Michael's hiking boots, but why would he have deviated from his planned route? I radioed back to base camp. "This is Martinez. I found what might be a footprint matching Michael's boots, but it's leading away from his intended path. I'm going to follow it and see where it leads." "Copy that, Martinez," came the crackled reply. "Be careful out there. That trail hasn't been maintained recently." I acknowledged the warning and set off down the right-hand path. Almost immediately I could see why it wasn't used often. The trail was overgrown, with branches reaching across the path and roots creating treacherous obstacles underfoot. The trees seemed to press in closer here, their gnarled trunks twisted into strange, almost humanoid shapes. As I pushed deeper into this less traveled part of the forest, the air grew noticeably cooler. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, leaving me in a perpetual green twilight. The silence, too, was different here. Deeper, more oppressive. Even the birds seemed to have fallen quiet. I continued to call out for Michael, but my voice sounded muffled and strange in the dense air. The forest seemed to swallow the sound, leaving me feeling increasingly isolated. After another hour of hiking, I came across a small clearing. My heart raced as I saw clear signs of human presence, a trampled area of grass, a few granola bar wrappers. Had Michael stopped here to rest? But as I examined the site more closely, my sense of unease grew. The wrappers were torn, not carefully opened. The grass wasn't just trampled, it was torn up in places, as if there had been a struggle, and there, partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf, was a smear of something dark and red. Blood. My hand went to the radio at my belt, but I hesitated before calling it in. I needed to be sure. Slowly, carefully, I began to search the clearing, looking for any other signs of what might have happened here. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they must belong to a bear. They were large, with clear claw marks visible in the soft earth. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen before. The shape was all wrong. Too elongated for a bear, too large for a wolf or mountain lion. And the claw marks. They were impossibly long and sharp. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led from the disturbed area of the clearing into the densest part of the forest, where the trees grew so close together they formed a nearly impenetrable wall of vegetation. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Perhaps Michael had encountered a bear and managed to fight it off, explaining the signs of struggle. Maybe he was injured and had sought shelter in the thick forest. But deep down, a part of me knew that what I was seeing didn't fit any explanation I could come up with. With shaking hands, I finally raised the radio to my lips. "Base camp, this is Martinez. I've found something. There are signs of a struggle and some blood. I've also discovered some unusual tracks. I'm going to need backup here. The radio crackled with static for a moment before a voice came through. Copy that, Martinez. Can you describe the tracks? Are they animal? I hesitated, not sure how to explain what I was seeing. I'm not sure. They're large, with prominent claw marks, but they don't match any animal I'm familiar with. There was a pause on the other end. When the voice came back, it was tight with concern. Martinez, hold your position. We're sending a team to your location. Do not follow those tracks alone. I repeat, do not follow those tracks alone. But even as I acknowledged the order, I knew I couldn't wait. If Michael was out there, injured, and possibly being stalked by some unknown predator, every minute could mean the difference between life and death. I'm sorry, I murmured, knowing I was about to disobey a direct order. But I can't leave him out there. With one last look at the ominous tree line, I took a deep breath and plunged into the forest, following the strange tracks into the unknown darkness beyond. The forest closed in around me as I pushed through the dense undergrowth. The trees here were old, their gnarled trunks covered in thick, ropey vines that seemed to writhe in the corner of my vision. The ground was treacherous, hidden roots and loose stones threatening to trip me with every step. I kept my eyes fixed on the tracks, which remained clearly visible in the soft, damp earth. They led me deeper into the forest, away from any trails or paths I was familiar with. The terrain began to slope downward, and I realized we were descending into a valley I hadn't known existed. The air grew colder and damper as I moved downhill. A thin mist began to rise from the ground, curling around my ankles and obscuring the forest floor. The silence was absolute now, not even the rustle of leaves disturbing the oppressive quiet. I had lost all sense of time in this green twilight world. My watch told me it had been over an hour since I'd left the clearing, but it felt like days. The forest had a disorienting effect, and more than once I had to stop and check my compass to ensure I was still following the tracks in a consistent direction. Suddenly, the ground dropped away sharply. I barely managed to catch myself on a nearby tree, my heart pounding as loose stones clattered down the steep incline before me. As I regained my balance, I saw that the tracks led directly down this treacherous slope. "What the hell were you chasing, Michael?" I muttered, peering into the gloom below. There was no choice but to follow. I began to make my way down the slope, using trees and exposed roots as handholds. The mist was thicker here, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The silence was broken only by my labored breathing and the occasional skitter of displaced rocks. About halfway down, my foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves. I fell hard, tumbling and sliding down the remainder of the slope. Pain shot through my body as I collided with rocks and branches. Finally, I came to a stop at the bottom, lying on my back and gasping for air. As I lay there, trying to catch my breath and assess my injuries, I became aware of a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. But as I focused on it, it grew clearer. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but deeper and more resonant than any human or animal I'd ever encountered. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to a sitting position. The mist swirled around me, but I could make out shapes in the gloom. I was in some sort of ravine, the steep slopes rising on either side. Ahead of me, the ravine opened up into what looked like a large cave mouth. The breathing sound was coming from the cave. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to climb out of this forsaken place and call for help. But I couldn't. Not when Michael might be in there, injured or worse. I got to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ribs. Nothing felt broken, but I'd be feeling this fall for days. I checked my pack. My first aid kit was intact, as was my flashlight. The radio, unfortunately, was smashed beyond repair. "Okay, Thomas," I said to myself, trying to steady my nerves. "You've come this far. Let's finish this." I took out my flashlight and clicked it on, grateful for its powerful beam cutting through the mist. Then, with a deep breath, I began to make my way towards the cave entrance. The breathing sound grew louder as I approached. It echoed off the ravine walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The cave mouth loomed before me, a great dark maw in the mountainside. The tracks I'd been following led straight inside. I paused at the entrance, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam seemed feeble against the absolute blackness within, but there, just at the edge of the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a backpack, torn and bloodied, but unmistakably the same one Michael had been carrying in the photo Valerie had shown me. "Michael?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cave. "Michael Lawson, are you in there?" The breathing sound stopped abruptly. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, from deep within the cave came a low, rumbling growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Part animal, part something else entirely. I took an involuntary step backward, my heart pounding in my chest. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew for certain what had happened to Michael. With shaking hands, I reached for the knife at my belt. It felt pitifully inadequate against whatever was in that cave, but it was all I had. "I'm coming in," I announced, as much to steady myself as to warn whatever was inside. "I'm here to help. I'm not going to hurt you." As I stepped into the cave, the darkness seemed to press in around me, as if it were a living thing trying to smother me. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rough stone walls slick with moisture. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, a musky animal scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I moved slowly, keeping my back to the wall and my eyes scanning constantly for any movement. The growling had stopped, but I could hear something moving ahead of me, a scraping sound, like claws on stone. "Michael?" I called again, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast darkness. "It's Thomas Martinez from Search and Rescue. If you can hear me, make a sound." The scraping stopped. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness ahead, I heard a weak, pained voice. "Help, please." My heart leapt. It was Michael. He was alive. "I'm coming, Michael," I called out, moving faster now. "Keep talking to me. I'm almost there." No. But as I rounded a bend in the cave, my flashlight illuminated a scene that stopped me dead in my tracks. Michael was there, propped against the cave wall. His clothes were torn and bloodied, and his face was pale with shock and pain. But it wasn't his condition that made my blood run cold. It was the creature crouched over him. At first glance it looked almost like a bear, but grotesquely misshapen. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, but patches of scaly skin showed through in places. Its head was massive, with a protruding snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. But its eyes were almost human, gleaming with a terrible intelligence. As my light fell upon it, the creature turned its head towards me and let out a bone-chilling roar. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Run!" Michael screamed. "For God's sake, run!" But I couldn't run. I couldn't leave him there. Instead, I did something that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. I charged forward, yelling at the top of my lungs and waving my flashlight wildly. The sudden noise and light seemed to confuse the creature. It reared back, giving me just enough time to reach Michael. I grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him towards the cave entrance. "Come on," I grunted. "We've got to move." Michael tried to help, but he was badly injured. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Behind us, I could hear the creature recovering from its momentary confusion. Its roar echoed through the cave, filled with rage and hunger. We were moving too slowly. I could hear the creature's claws scraping on the stone as it pursued us. The cave entrance seemed impossibly far away. "Leave me," Michael gasped. "Save yourself." "Not a chance," I growled, pulling him along with renewed determination. The creature was right behind us now. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. In desperation, I turned and swung my flashlight with all my might. There was a sickening crunch as it connected with the creature's snout. The beast reeled back, letting out a high-pitched shriek of pain. Taking advantage of its momentary distraction, I heaved Michael onto my shoulders in a fireman's carry and ran for the exit. My lungs were burning, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I could hear the creature recovering, its enraged roars spurring me on. Finally, mercifully, we burst out of the cave into the misty ravine, but we weren't safe yet. The steep slope that had given me so much trouble on the way down now loomed before us like an insurmountable obstacle. "Hold on tight," I told Michael, beginning to climb. It was agonizing work. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Michael did his best to cling to me, but I could feel him slipping. Behind us, the creature emerged from the cave. It paused for a moment, as if reluctant to leave its lair. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, it began to pursue us up the slope. I climbed faster than I ever had in my life, desperation lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. Roots tore at my hands, rocks cut into my knees, but I didn't slow down. We were about halfway up when I heard Michael cry out in pain. His grip loosened, and before I could react, he slipped from my shoulders. I turned just in time to see him tumbling down the slope directly towards the waiting creature. Without thinking, I threw myself after him. I managed to grab his arm, but the momentum carried us both down. We rolled and slid, coming to a stop just yards from the snarling beast. The creature advanced slowly, savoring its victory. I pushed myself to my feet, placing myself between it and Michael. My hand went to my belt, grasping the handle of my knife. It was a futile gesture. The small blade would be useless against this monstrosity, but I was determined to go down fighting. Just as the creature tensed to spring, a gunshot rang out. The beast roared in pain and confusion. More shots followed, and I saw dark blood matting its fur. I turned to see a group of forest rangers charging down the slope, rifles at the ready. The creature, faced with this new threat, let out one final defiant roar before retreating into the cave. As the rangers reached us, I finally allowed myself to collapse, the adrenaline draining from my body. The last thing I remember before passing out was one of the rangers calling for a medical evacuation. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body aching but alive. Over the next few days as I recovered, I learned what had happened after I lost consciousness. The backup team I had called for had tracked my last known location. When they found signs of my fall, they followed the ravine and heard the commotion from our escape. Their timely arrival had saved both Michael's and my life. Michael had survived as well, though his injuries were severe. He had multiple fractures, deep lacerations, and would need extensive surgery and rehabilitation. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. As for the creature, an extensive search of the cave system had turned up nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The official report cited an attack by an unidentified large predator, but those of us who had seen it knew the truth was far stranger and more terrifying. Valerie came to visit me in the hospital. The relief and gratitude in her eyes were almost painful to see. "You saved his life," she said, grasping my hand. "How can I ever thank you?" I just shook my head. "I was just doing my job," I said, but we both knew that wasn't entirely true. What I had done went far beyond the call of duty. As I recovered and eventually returned to work, I found that my experience had changed me. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now held a sense of lurking danger. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every unexplained sound set my nerves on edge. But I didn't quit. If anything, my resolve to protect and rescue those in need grew stronger. I threw myself into my work with renewed dedication, determined to be better prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. And late at night, when the house was quiet and sleep eluded me, I would find myself thinking about that creature in the cave. What was it? Where had it come from? And most chillingly, were there more of them out there? I knew that I might never have answers to these questions, but I also knew that I would spend the rest of my career, the rest of my life, watching, waiting, and ready to face whatever horrors might be lurking in the shadows of the wilderness. Because that's what we do in search and rescue. We venture into the unknown, facing danger and fear to bring the lost ones home. And no matter what terrors may await us in the depths of the forest, we'll be there, ready to shine a light into the darkness and guide the way to safety.